So I would like to continue with the discussion of comprehension models and frameworks. Now I would like to discuss the integrated cognitive theory of comprehension, which is an eclectic model, which I presented in 2017, and it comprises of two stages, pre-comprehension and comprehension. Now let me just give you some preliminary ideas and some vocabulary that we will need to know about before we get started. As I mentioned before, comprehension, generally speaking, regardless of whether it's reading or listening, can be defined as the process of extracting meaning from perceptual, visual, and or oral stimuli. Now, some of the common comprehension mechanisms that we will learn about or we have already discussed so far in the previous videos include the situation model, inference making, which is the process of extracting implicit meaning, and the generation of visual mental imageries or just mental imageries, which is a process of creating some representations in the mind. The representation of the message that you hear or the message that you read. Now, the aim of this model that I'm going to present is to merge the otherwise fragmented or piecemeal findings in reading and listening research. The model is maximalist in nature, and the difference, there are two types of models in comprehension. One is maximalist and the other one is minimalist. Minimalists focus primarily on bottom-up processing or bottom-up comprehension, which I discussed in the previous videos. On the other hand, maximalists have a focus on both bottom-up and top-down process, and they define listening or reading comprehension as the process of bottom-up or literal comprehension and top-down or inferential comprehension. So I would like to present the schematic representation of the model to you here. And as you see, there are two stages which have been highlighted in this model. One of them here is the perception and recognition, that's stage one, and the other one is the comprehension stage. Perception and recognition constitute the pre-comprehension process. On the other hand, selection and integration, or construction and integration, construction is another word for selection, constitute the comprehension process. Now I would like to talk about these stages at some detail, but for further information I would like to invite you to read the paper itself. So, first of all, the process of pre-comprehension. This stage consists of perception and word recognition. Perception refers to the process of hearing. When we hear the signal, we convert the signal to some electrical impulses, and then they're transferred through the nervous system to certain parts of the brain. Most often, I would say to the left hemisphere, at least that's one of the places that the signal goes, and the process, and some places like the inferior frontal gyrus, etc., take that signal and they start processing it. This is perception, and it's quite mechanical and physiological, during which we do not generate any meaning. Then comes the process of word recognition. There have been quite a few attempts to describe word recognition. Three early models include the search model, the logogen model, and the cohort model. I'm not going through the details of these three models, but I think it would be nice to know that there are common features between these three models, and that's they stress the importance of vocabulary and word recognition during pre-comprehension. For further information, I would recommend that you look at the Frauenfelder and Tyler's 1987 paper. It's really a wonderful paper. So during word recognition, I have argued in my model that three processes or three stages take place. In the first stage, we segment and select what we hear. During this stage, we find words' constituents or phonemes and boundaries between them. If you notice, between every two words on this slide, there is a little bit of white space. For example, between segmentation and there's a little bit of white space right there. This white space helps us to understand or to identify the boundaries between the two vocabulary words here. However, in listening comprehension, there is no such visible boundary, and therefore the brain has to work harder in order to identify the boundaries between every two words. And in the same way, there is a boundary between phonemes. So during the first stage, our brain segments and selects words. And then comes recognition. During recognition, or stage 2, we select the proper mental representation for whatever we have segmented so far. And finally, during the lexical access, we access the phonological, semantic, and syntactic representations of that word. In other words, we start to retrieve anything that we know about that word from our long-term memory. This is analogous to the comprehension at the word level. Now, there's a consideration here, or two considerations if you count each of them as one. Autonomous models as one and interaction models as the other one. In word recognition, autonomous models assume that there is no context effect before the completion of lexical processing, whereas interactionalist models assume that there is a context and world knowledge effect. So our world knowledge or the context of situation help us during the lexical processing. Now, as to which one is more accurate, it's really difficult to say. I personally assume that it's like a combination of both. Sometimes where we don't have any world knowledge or there is no context clue, we might just do it in the fashion that autonomous models have predicted. On the other hand, if there are some we do have the world knowledge about the word that we are processing, or there are some contextual clues, we might do word recognition in the way that interactionalist models have predicted. In addition, let's assume that you don't know the meaning of a word that you are processing. I think what interactionalist models are predicting would be more applicable because especially high ability listeners do not stop processing the message if they encounter a word that they don't understand or they don't recognize. What they will do most likely is to shift to using comprehension strategies, that is to collect some clues and information from the context and to rely on their world knowledge to guess the meaning of the word that they don't know in order to recognize and understand the word. Now, this is the pre-comprehension stage of the model which I discussed and presented. This model, the pre-comprehension. Now I want to go to the comprehension stage and discuss it in some detail. Here's a preface actually to comprehension. What I would like to present is primarily based on the construction integration model by Kinch, which was published in 1998. And this is the book in which the model has been presented. It's called Comprehension, a Paradigm for Cognition. Now, I should say that this model is not the only game in town. There are other models like the landscape theory, like comprehension as an event indexing process, scenario mapping comprehension, and also immersed experiencer model of comprehension. I'm not going through these. You can take a look at the paper that discusses these in some details. But I think it's good to know that the construction integration model is probably the most influential of these among these models, and it has had some impacts on language learning, research, and assessment as well. Now, Kinch argues that comprehension should be investigated or grounded within the framework of cognition. Cognition is a two-stage or is a two-concept kind of definition. In the first stage, or the first type of cognition, I should say, includes perception. Perception is, like what I have discussed before, is passive and mostly automatic. On the other hand, some part of our cognition is analytic. So we do a lot of analytical thinking and problem solving, and as a result, this kind of cognition is more effortful and active and engages the listener a lot more than the perception process, which is more automatic and perhaps less energy consuming. Now, with these preliminary ideas out of the way, I would like to present the construction integration model itself. It assumes that comprehension is a three-stage process. In the first stage, we generate a surface level, then followed by the generation of a text-based level representation of the text. Finally, we generate the situation model. That's the final mental representation that we generate during comprehension. So the surface level representation concerns the generation of the memory for exact or actual words that we hear. In addition, the text-based level is a semantic level representation of ideas that we hear or we read, and as a result we can say that it's kind of a crude form of ideas, crude in the sense that the mental representations of the sentences that we read or we hear are not cogent and are not coherent because we still have not created any connections between them in our working memory or our long-term memory. And finally, it includes some microstructures. That's the syntactic structure of the sentences or the propositions we read, and macrostructure, which includes the discourse and organization of the text. I have represented text space here in this kind of shape. The background is dark, meaning that this is the boundaries of the text space that we have. And there are some propositions which have been represented as oval shapes and rectangles here. As you see, there's no connection between them at this stage, and they're all over the place. We don't know how and in what fashion they are connected to each other. Now, at this stage, which is a text space, we have a sort of crude understanding of the text that we hear or we read, but it's only during the generation of the situation model where we can create connections and links between those ideas which are otherwise not connected to each other. So depending on the goals of comprehension and our prior knowledge, we can rearrange these ideas into these idea units or propositions and create connections. The line that cuts across rectangles and the line that cuts across the oval shapes represents our attempts, for example, our act of adding our world knowledge or background information to create connections and to fill in the gaps between those propositions. And also you see that one of the propositions here, which has been represented by a gray rectangle, is eliminated from the situation model. This means that sometimes, even though we process the information that we heard, we might find that proposition or that piece of information is not closely relevant to what we are, to the rest of the message that we are hearing. And as a result, we just simply eliminate it. Whereas it's not eliminated when we are generating the text base. So that's the difference between the situation model, which is created during the top-down and bottom-up processing, versus the text-based model, which is created primarily during a bottom-up processing. In the end, it's interesting to know, to read this advice from Kinch, because it's, I think, applicable to instructions and language learning classes. He says, in instruction, it's usually the situation model that the student forms from reading a text that is of interest. The teacher does not care whether the student can recite the text, but whether the student understood it correctly and for future use, was able to integrate the textual information with whatever background knowledge there was. So that's everything that the integrated cognitive theory of comprehension discusses, but actually I have discussed it quite briefly. For further information, you can take a look at the paper. Now, I would like to say that the model that was presented is not the only model that we can find in the listening literature. There are similar models, especially in the field of communication research, which basically touch more or less on the same kind of process. Burleson's model is one of these representations of listening comprehension, which presents a constructivist model of listening, which is basically based on an information processing way or approach to listening. Here we have a few stages, and if you go through these stages, you can find that listening has been broken down into again, perception, bottom-up processing, and top-down processing. The perception is here the transmission of utterances or messages. And actually, there is also a recognition stage here, which I should have said. This is the received words, phrases, and behaviors are made sense of. And behavior refers to body language, not body language, gestures, and eye contacts. And then starts the process of, bottom-up comprehension. That's understanding of what others have said. And then these three stages have to do with top-down processing, which are also analogous to the integration process in Walter Kinch model of comprehension. That's understanding what the speaker means, what they're doing, and the purposes of their speaker. Okay, so, well, it started to rain. I think you might hear some background noise. I hope they will not distract you. Okay, so these models are not the only way that listening comprehension has been represented in the previous research. In the field of language learning, especially second language learning, we have some sort of models which are referred to as sub-skill based models of comprehension.